Hello, John Talley here with Partzilla.com, and welcome to the first video of a series that's going to show you how to completely assemble a 2017 Yamaha Raptor 700R engine. Starts off with just the engine cases, the bearings. We're going to carry this video a little bit further by putting in the transmission, the shift forks, the counterbalancers, and most importantly, the crankshaft. Now, as far as the parts list goes, why don't you reference that description below? It's going to take you directly to all the parts that we used for this particular segment of the video. Now, the tools, well, you're going to need your entire toolbox, but first, let's also go look at the special tools that you're going to need to pull this off. First is a good bearing driver set. I prefer one made out of aluminum. Less chance of marring up anything inside of the engine. The other one that is critically important is going to be something to pull your crankshaft into the case half. The one I prefer is one made by Motion Pro. It works on several different makes and models. Now, if you're going to do this on a different machine, you might want to check with Motion Pro first to make sure it'll fit that application. So, once you've got your special tools together and already gathered your parts, we can get this started. So let's go. Now, I know everything came in its nice little packages and it seems to be clean, but that's not always the case. So before we even get started, we're going to clean up the cases with some contact cleaner. Now, when Yamaha manufactures these, when they come out of the castings and they go through the finish process, they do a really good job of getting them clean. There's still that chance you're going to have some residual left. So we want every surface to be as clean as we can get it, because if there's any dirt or rust or anything else, guess what? That's just going to get mixed in with your brand new engine parts. I mean, look at that. I don't want that flying around in my engine, so that's why we're doing this. Now, I know this is a bit of a daunting task, but the way I usually approach it, lay it out and then just place everything where it should go. I've got the main bearing that's going to go in this side of the case in the freezer at the moment. If you're not going to use that technique and you are going to press it in, don't just set your cases up and push against this outer edge. If you look, it gets really thin here and here. And if you're trying to press in that much surface into this area, I mean, it's not designed to take that kind of stress if you pushed on it with it being flat. If you are going to push it in, make sure that you put something that goes against this center section right here. And in most cases, you're replacing a bearing, use your old bearing, put it on the back side. Another thing that I would recommend, cut out just a 4-inch piece of plywood, place it there, then lay it on the press and press in the bearing. We're going to have this as a backup because I've tried this technique before. Most of the time it works. If you have your engine cases hot enough and if your bearing is cold enough, it'll just drop straight in. I have had them where they went halfway and just kind of stopped, and then I had to press them the rest of the way. So I'm going to go grab a torch. We're going to heat this up as evenly as we can to get it around that 200 to 300 degree range. If you do want to use your oven instead of doing it this way, set it to around 275. Set it in there for about 20 minutes and that should do it. She's hovering around in between 180 and 200. I'm going to grab that bearing, see if she drops in. Oh, so close. Made it about halfway. So we're going to head over to the press and finish it off. Keep in mind this whole case is extremely warm at the moment, so make sure you got gloves on if you attempted to do it that way. I almost had it. Looks like it went in just a little cockeyed when I dropped it. And as soon as I did, it locked it down. But that's all right. We'll just press it in the rest of the way. Now, whatever driver that you're using, make sure it reaches out to that outer race. There we go. I was getting worried. All right, she's in. Let's take a look at it. But I think we're okay. That was the most challenging bearing to get in. Now we can go ahead and get a clean cloth over there and just lay it flat inside the press. Make sure we've got enough surface area because I don't want to stress the cases anywhere as we're pressing these in. Once again, make sure you're only pushing on the outside of the race. So not nearly as much stress putting in these smaller bearings. As you're doing this, just make sure you pick out the right size driver for each bearing. And next, get in our 2 counterbalance bearings. And they're both identical. Okay, we got one side out of the way. Let's head over to the other one. This one's a little bit different. We actually have a couple of passageways that we need to be sealed off against. And you'll notice that the bearings, of course, were a different part number, where it has the sealed side, and that's going to need to go facing out. It'll look the same, but you want to make sure that these bearings didn't mistakenly get put on that side. Now this first counterbalancer, or the one that's in the back, it actually has a transmission or a lowercase breather tube that comes out up top. It has to be sealed away as well, and that is what this seal is for. So don't forget to put this seal in, otherwise you're just going to be pumping oil straight out of that vent. So let's start with the output shaft bearing first. We're going to use our wood again. Now let's go press it down. Next, let's go for that intermediate. All right, the trick here, we need this edge to be right here. So now we got to bring all of that over here. Seal down. There we go. Okay, we've got the first 2 in, now we got 2 left, and this one here, do not forget to put in this seal. That should do it. Now, let's go get the bearing pressed in. That looks good. Let's go ahead and get that last one in. That should do it. So we've got all the bearings pressed in, minus the crankshaft. Let's go ahead and get the retainers that are going to be at the output bearing. And then there's another one over on this side for that secondary gear shaft. We'll start over here, lay the keepers in place. What you have are a couple of T30 bolts, but it's important that you put a little bit of Loctite on them, because you would not want these to come apart or to come out inside of the cases. It would not end well. Every thread of this size is going to have the same torque, or close to it, 7.2 foot-pounds. We're going to set it to 8. And the same thing for these, and you want to make sure this little stamp that says out, make sure that's facing towards you. Same torque as the other. Now we want to go back and just use a punch and put a stake mark on both of these bolts. You want to put it right at the edge of the bolt and the retainer. So we've got one more bearing to pull in, and that's going to be the crank. So it's been in the freezer for a while. Let me go pick it up, bring it over, and we'll get it pulled in. I'd actually sprayed it down with silicone to keep it from rusting, because as you can see, when it comes out, the humidity where I live, it just attacks it. So let's start off by attaching a bolt, and actually the one I'm using is the same thread and pitch as the one they use on the swing arm. I just ordered an extra one, ground it down to where it actually fits inside of this adapter. But the real trick here is, on this side of the case, there's not a flat surface for this piece to actually sit in there to pull. So what we're having to do is just pass the crank up through, just use a steel plate. We put that adapter on it and then crank it into position. No pun intended. Now if you didn't have a steel plate this size, you could always go to just a couple of pieces of angle iron, just something stout enough to go across. A little bit of heat goes a long way. Just make sure you don't get it too hot and damage that seal that's in there. Remember, for the counterbalancer. Make sure that the bearing is pulled all the way up into the casing, and it looks like we've got it. So what I'm going to do next is release the puller. And if you're unsure whether or not yours is all the way down, get a feeler gauge, and the smallest one that you have, and make sure that you cannot get it in between the case and the bearing surface. As you can see, they are flush up next to each other, and that's what we want. We're going to coat it back down, set it to the side, and then we're going to build up those transmission pieces. Well, let me go get all the parts for the transmission, and we'll lay those out and start assembling the gears on the different shafts. Starts with the primary drive axle, and then what we're going to do is lay out each gear and snap ring and retainer and everything in order. But before we start putting it together, I want to get everything cleaned up. So we're going to go piece by piece, use a little contact cleaner, get it cleaned up. Then we'll break out the oil can and start putting it together. Now look at that mess coming off. This is why this is important. So we've got everything cleaned up and ready to go. We're going to start with the main axle assembly and all of our pinion gears. So I believe it's 5, 3, 4, and 2. Everything's in order, so let's start putting it together. As you're doing this, oil up everything as you're going along. Now, if you know that it's going to be a while before your engine's going to get used, I'd probably recommend using some type of assembly lube instead of just oil. Then our spline washer. Then our circlip, and it's going to be pushing out, so we want the sharp side going toward the thrust. And just spread this enough to get it over. You don't want to hyperextend your circlip. One down, several to go. Each gear that you put on, spin it, make sure it's free and there's no burrs anywhere. This feels good, so let's go on to the next. A little bit more oil. This is the 4th gear pinion. And as you can tell, it has to move either side on the shaft, and it's just held in place by those 2 circlips we just installed. But what will actually be limiting its travel is that's where the shift fork is going to grab it right here. So it'll be shifted back and forth right there. Next we have another splined washer. Then this spline collar. Then the gear. So that was the 3rd wheel, and the next part is going to be this locking claw. And actually, this piece goes in, and then it is turned just a half a tooth, and then this part that locks it goes in, and that right there will lock it in place. See, I can't pull it off now. Neat little setup they have there. Then one more gear to go on this one. A little bit more oil. One final circlip. Now, let's tackle the output shaft. So let's go and get our collar oiled up and start installing some gears. Splined washer. And this particular shaft uses a little bit different snap rings, but you still want to look for that sharp edge. As you're putting these on, resist the temptation just to drive it down, because that's going to scar up your splines. So make sure you've got it lifted off the shaft as you're pushing it down. It takes a little time, but it'll go. All right, next gear. Another circlip, sharp edge facing down on this one. Another washer. This collar. Now we have another one of those claw type scenarios. Drop this one down, rotate it by half a tooth, and then this one will lock it in place. Next gear, This section is a little bit more raised than the back side. We want that to go inward. Another collar. Let's add a little bit more oil in between those two. Another washer and another circlip. Starting to see a repeating theme here. It's kind of hard to believe all this stuff flies around as fast as it does inside of an engine. It actually works. One more washer, and then one last circlip. So, with that done, let's go grab the engine cases, our shift forks, and the shift drum, and start getting this thing put back together so we can close up the bottom end. Before we install this, I want to go ahead and install the reverse shift detent or lever, because I'd hate to have it fall out if I tried to do this afterwards. So we're at least going to get its washer, get the bearing in there, then we have one more washer on the outside, and then just a C-clip to get it held in place. So let's set that up for a minute. Go and get the seal pushed in. Not much to it. Do it with your thumb. Don't forget that washer. Pass it through. That second washer. Then we just need to slide on this other C-clip. There we go. All right, with that in place, let's go ahead and put a little bit more oil on our bearings, especially the ones that are in the blind parts of the casing, because it's going to be critical for those to have some oil on startup. Now, let's go ahead and carry our primary and output shafts matched up like this. Bring them into position. Like that. Now, we want to take our shift forks, and we'll start with the L, and that's going to be over on the output shaft, and it's going to be almost down at the bottom. You can see where it engages. Now when you do this, don't insert it into the case. Just put it off to the side, and we want the actual gear, that surrounded area, to hold it in place. Next, we're going to take our second set of shift forks and do the same thing. Go ahead and start with the top one, then bring down that C, and then once again just shift it off to the side. Now we can take the shift drum, have your pin in this general area, which should be first and or neutral. Drop it in. What we can do is lift up the various gears to where you can get it to align into the drum like that. Now we can push the pins in. So we've got that one done. Now this one's a little bit more tricky because you're messing with two at the same time. So let's bring up the bottom one first. Grab that top one and get it in position. There you go. Swing it around and push the pin in. Got it. There's neutral. Next, let's get the reverse shaft in. The way I do this, take off the circlip temporarily on first gear. Where's that second? That's second actually. Pop it off. Now, when you're dropping this in, you want to make sure that this edge lines up with the protrusion down inside the casing. And you should not be able to turn this once it's in position. Now we can put our gear back on. Another way to tell that you've got the reverse shaft in there correctly is these two gears are going to be even with each other. If we're not all the way down in there, this one would be sticking up. You could get it to install, but it would be riding a little bit high, and you could probably get the cases together, but when you did, it would not mesh very well, and it would probably end up cracking the cases. So just make very sure it's in that indentation before you get ready to close everything up. Now, counterbalancers just drop straight in. They're completely different as far as their diameter, so there's no mixing them up. Well, all right, we're getting very close to being ready to seal the cases together. But there's a couple more pieces that have to be installed. One, this pickup screen, and there actually is no gasket or anything. It just lays in there, and then it has a couple of 8mm head bolts. But if it's inside the block, nothing wrong with a little Loctite. So I would hate for any of this to come apart and start flying around. The other critical part is this little dowel and this O-ring that goes dead center, and it's an oil pass through from one side of the case to the other. So don't forget that. Otherwise you are going to have some severe lubrication issues or the lack thereof. Now at this point we can go ahead and put in our dowels, and from the factory they only send these two smaller ones. They actually go here and here. Now if you've really hopped up your engine and you want a little bit more support for the block or the cases, the same dowels that are used at the base of the cylinder, well, they happen to be the same diameter as these 2 points right here. So if you want to make sure that your cases don't shift anywhere, you can get those ordered, a couple extra bucks, a little bit of peace of mind. Now, with that being said, we want to wipe down these surfaces one more time, because just a little bit of oil is going to keep that Yamaha from really doing its job and sealing up the crankcases as they should be. So, we've got this case ready to go. Everything's cleaned up. This is the last chance you have to check things over. Just run through it one more time. Make sure you don't miss anything. So, let's start spreading some Yamaha 4. What I usually do is just lay a fairly thin bead, and then we're going to go back and smear it around. And you don't want to put too much, because whatever you see squished out on the outside, well, probably that same amount went on the inside, and we don't want this stuff flying around our cases. Like I said, you just want a nice thin layer. It's not going to take much. Now, carefully, and don't put too much on there, go ahead and oil your bearings on this side. All right, I think I've got us ready to go now. One thing I want to point out before we close her up, I have the shift drum positioned to where I can engage that reverse claw, because I want it held still, not for right now, but when we get the cases closed up, one of the first bolts that we have to put through is for the shift drum, and that takes 22 foot-pounds, and I wouldn't want to stress the transmission with that kind of torque without holding it somehow. And that's a great way to do it with that reverse claw down at the bottom. So that being said, let's get it put together. All right, she's down. Now, let's put some bolts in. There's 3 on this side. There's 1, 2, and then there's one hidden right here. And that one we want to get some Loctite on. If you don't have them laid out in the exact order that they're going to go in, each bolt is going to be sticking up approximately that far. Any more, any less, you've got the wrong bolt in the wrong hole. This one we've got a little bit of red Loctite. We're going to go ahead and drop it in. It's always the same answer on the torque. 7.2 pounds, I typically take them to 8. The way we'll do this is we'll run them all in just with this small 1/4 inch ratchet. Then we'll come back and go more or less in sequence all the way around and torque them all down evenly. If you do it like this, make sure you're not holding the extension, because that would skew the torque. And guys, that pretty much wraps up the bottom end. What I'm going to do next is actually mount it to an engine stand to go to the next stage of the build. And that way you've got 360-degree access of me finishing up this engine. So if you need it, there it is. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the section below, and we will do our best to answer them. Well, listen, if you need any parts for your machine, come see us at Partzilla.com. Want to watch what happens next on this engine? Follow us over to the next video. With that being said, thank you and have a great day.